Story number 1. My name is Garrett, and this happened when I was a sophomore in college. After my freshman year, I didn't manage to get a dorm room, so I had to scramble for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op, a three-house community that was sort of near campus, but not exactly close. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap. And at the time, I didn't have many options. I had a bike, so I didn't really mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents in the co-op were students like me, young, broke, and just trying to get by. But there were a few exceptions. A handful of alumni lived there too. One or two were TAs, and a few others were older adults, people getting their degrees later in life. But the person who immediately stood out to me was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. From what I could tell, she was probably in her late 50s, though she looked older than that. Her hair was streaked with gray, and she walked with a noticeable limp. Like she had some kind of back or hip injury. She didn't talk much. Actually, she didn't talk at all, at least not that I saw. She mostly kept to herself, always moving slowly, always wearing the same blank, expressionless look on her face. I assumed she had some kind of university connection, maybe faculty, or maybe an alum. No one explained, and I didn't ask. The first time I saw her do something that really made me pause was in our common kitchen. That in itself was a little strange. The two other houses had their own kitchens, so I wasn't sure why she'd be using ours. But she wasn't cooking. She wasn't eating. And she wasn't talking to anyone either. She was just standing there. The rest of us were laughing, talking, running around trying to make dinner. Someone had music playing. It was a lively, chaotic mess. But she didn't try to join in. She just stood against the far wall and watched. Her eyes scanned the room, but every time I looked up, I caught her gaze. It felt like she was watching me, specifically me, even though I knew how paranoid that sounded. No one acknowledged her presence. Not once. That struck me as strange. It was like she was invisible to everyone but me. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Later that week, I was doing homework in my room when I saw her again. I glanced out my bedroom window, and there she was. Standing alone in the street. Just staring up at my window. She wasn't on the sidewalk or even near a curb. She was directly in the middle of the road. And it was getting late. Cold, too. The kind of cold where your breath fogs the glass and your fingers start to go numb if you're not wearing gloves. But there she stood, perfectly still. I couldn't tell if she was looking directly at me or just in the general direction of the house. But I felt it again, that weird sense that her eyes were locked onto mine. I don't know what came over me, but I raised my hand and gave her a small wave. It was meant to be polite. Just a little neighborly gesture. But the moment I did it, I regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down a few times, like a little kid who just got good news, and then suddenly turned and ran. Not walked, not limped. She ran toward one of the other houses, presumably her own. I felt sick to my stomach. Not only had I acknowledged her presence, I had confirmed that she had been staring into my window. And even if she hadn't been, well, she knew now that I saw her. "Which room is yours?" That was the first thing she ever said to me. It was later that night, and I still couldn't shake the image of her standing in the middle of the street, staring up at my window. I ended up bringing her up in conversation with one of my housemates. I asked casually if he knew anything about the older woman who lived in one of the other houses. He didn't seem surprised by the question. "She's always been around," he said, barely looking up from his laptop. "Best to just ignore her. That's what the rest of us do." I pushed a little, curious. "But who is she? Why is she even here?" He shrugged. "I don't really know. That's just what someone told me when I moved in." That answer didn't sit right with me. It felt like everyone knew something I didn't, or worse, like no one actually cared. So I started asking around. Eventually, I got something that resembled an answer. One of the seniors, someone who actually lived in the same house as her, told me she was loosely affiliated with the university. He described her as a little kooky, but added that she'd never been violent or threatening. She keeps to herself, he said. She's weird, yeah, but harmless. I asked him why no one else seemed to think it was bizarre that she was living among a bunch of students, clearly detached from everyone and everything. He just shrugged and said, "We don't get to decide who lives here. That's all up to the property manager." I wasn't satisfied with that answer. Not even close. But I also didn't know what else to do. So I tried to put it out of my mind. But then it got worse. One night, I stepped out of my room and nearly ran into her. She was standing directly in front of my door, just a few inches away. I literally jumped back. She caught me completely off guard. It was late. Well past midnight on a Tuesday. The house was dead silent. Everyone was either asleep or out. I blinked at her, unsure of what to say. But she didn't say a word. She didn't even seem startled. Instead, she turned around, calmly, and walked away, as if I were the one who had startled her. That wasn't the last time, either. I won't go into every little detail, but there were several more encounters like that. I'd find her snooping in areas she clearly didn't belong. Like the basement storage, or peering into bedrooms of people who weren't home. Sometimes she'd just be there, hovering around corners or standing silently in common spaces, staring at nothing. Or maybe staring at me, it was hard to tell. Then I lost my room key. Each house in the co-op used to be part of the same hotel, way back in the day, so every room still had individual locks and metal keys. A lot of people didn't bother locking their rooms anymore, it was a shared space, and most residents trusted each other. But not me. I couldn't sleep knowing my door was unlocked. I always kept it shut tight. So losing that key? That was a big deal. Thankfully, I had a spare. Everyone was given one. But I was still pissed. Making a new copy was going to cost me money I didn't really have, and time I didn't want to waste. A few nights later, something happened. I woke up in the middle of the night. No noise. No nightmare. Just this odd, instinctual jolt, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up. At first, I didn't hear anything. I sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of the house. And then, I heard it. A soft bumping sound. Quiet. Repetitive. It was coming from just outside my room. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway like I thought. It was coming from inside my closet. Every 20 seconds or so, I'd hear it, this soft, subtle shift, like something, or someone, was moving inside. Just the faintest scrape of fabric. A slight creak of the floorboards beneath the door. Something was in there. Now, I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. And I'm definitely not the type to freeze up when things get dangerous. If something was going on in my room, I was going to deal with it myself. I sat up slowly and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My feet hit the floor quietly. I took a deep breath and stood, trying to control my breathing, trying to slow my heartbeat. It was racing. I walked across the room, step by step, until I was standing just inches from the closet door. I could hear the bumping again, faint, but steady. I clenched my jaw, counted to 3 in my head. Then, in one fluid motion, I ripped the door open and screamed, a wild, unhinged scream meant to scare off whatever might be inside. And there she was. Just like I had feared. The woman was crouched in the back of my closet. She had one of my ties wrapped tightly around her neck like some kind of scarf. Her eyes were wide, stretched unnaturally open, unblinking. In her other hand, she clutched a kitchen knife. My scream startled her, and before I could even react, she lunged at me. The knife came out first, flashing in the light. She didn't say anything, just charged. I screamed again, but this time it wasn't a bluff. It was real. It was pure terror. I grabbed her as she came at me, and we crashed to the floor. She was small and frail, but she fought like hell. Kicking, biting, clawing, screaming the entire time. I wrestled the knife from her hand and pinned her down, my adrenaline doing most of the work. I yelled for help. Seconds later, I heard doors slamming and footsteps pounding down the hall. My friend Lee was the first one to reach me. Without hesitation, he helped me restrain her. The two of us held her down while someone else called the police. The rest of that night is a blur. The cops arrived quickly. They arrested her on the spot. By then, she had stopped screaming, but she wouldn't say a word either, not to them, not to us. Just total silence. They found my missing room key in her pocket. No surprise there. A few weeks later, we finally got the full story. Apparently, she was the property manager's sister. He had been letting her live in one of the unoccupied rooms under the radar, without telling anyone. She had a long history of severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her the care she desperately needed, he'd just hidden her away in our community. Tossed her into a house full of students and hoped for the best. The property manager was eventually arrested. Thankfully, charged with negligence and a whole bunch of other things. And honestly, I blame him so much more than I blame her. She needed help. She didn't belong in a shared student home. She shouldn't have been left to wander halls and watch strangers from windows. If anything, I feel bad for her. But no amount of pity erases what happened. She tried to kill me. I could have lost my life that night, over something I still don't understand. I have no idea why she seemed so fixated on me. Why she watched me. Why she stood in the street. Why she crept through the halls at night. I guess I'll never know. I'm graduating soon, and part of me is going to miss college. The people. The freedom. The energy of it all. But I also know I'll never be able to think about my time here without remembering that night, without picturing her face in the dark, crouched in my closet, with a knife in her hand. Story number 2. This isn't really my story, but I essentially watched the whole thing happen. So I'm telling it anyway. I've lived in a modest 2-story home with my husband, Benjamin, for the better part of 20 years now. All of our kids are out living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. But what I'm about to tell you happened just last year. Someone had finally moved into the house across the street, which was a relief, because I was getting sick of looking out at a vacant house all the time. I'm retired, so I spend a lot of time on my front porch. Knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with my husband, you name it. I also listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. Sometimes I just play music while I sit out there. The person who moved in was a young guy, maybe mid-20s. He drove an expensive-looking BMW and always dressed in flashy clothes. So I figured he was either doing very well, or seriously pretending. Now, I hope I'm not giving you the wrong impression about him. He was actually really sweet. He introduced himself to us after a few days. His name was Quinn, and he was a few years out of college, just like I had guessed. He was a really bright guy and got along well with Benjamin. They laughed and talked about sports, and Benjamin even dropped a few old college stories I hadn't heard in years. Quinn said he worked in the entertainment industry. He did freelance work for some internet personality, or something like that. Whatever it was, it kind of went over my head, but it must have been lucrative. He definitely looked wealthy. He talked about stocks with Benjamin and mentioned some of the investments he was making. All in all, he seemed like a nice guy. Things were normal for a few months. Like I said, I spent a lot of time on my porch, so Quinn would often wave to me when he left his house. I always waved back. I can't remember exactly when I first noticed her, but at some point, I started seeing the same girl going over to Quinn's house every so often. She drove a little white convertible. Young. Blonde. The kind of girl you'd expect a guy like Quinn to date, to be honest. To be frank, she dressed a bit scandalously, which I didn't fully appreciate. But I figured she was his girlfriend, maybe checking on the house while he was out. She had her own key, so it made sense. It became a regular thing. Once, maybe twice a week, I'd see that car roll up while Quinn was gone, and she'd go inside. She'd stay for a while, then leave. I didn't really understand what she was doing, but young people date differently these days, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Then one evening, I finally saw them together. Quinn pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat. That confirmed it. She was his girlfriend, just like I'd assumed. But shortly after that day, things started to get tense. At least, that's how it seemed from where I was. One afternoon, I was out tending to my little garden when I heard shouting from across the street. I looked up and saw Quinn and the girl standing in the driveway, yelling at each other. I couldn't catch what they were arguing about, but I didn't need to. She kept throwing her hands in the air, practically spitting her words at him. It looked like she was going to strike him. Eventually, she got into her car, slammed the door, and tore off down the road. Quinn just stood there, shook his head, and went back inside. I don't even think he noticed me standing there. I figured it was just a lover's spat. Every couple fights sometimes, and it wasn't my place to butt in where I wasn't welcome. But then, I started seeing her car in front of his house again. Not once. Not twice. But several times, and always when Quinn wasn't home. I told Benjamin, and he said it was rude to pry. That I should leave the poor boy alone. And I agreed, at least, I thought I did. But then came the night everything went sideways. Benjamin and I were asleep when we both woke up to the sound of sirens blaring outside. We rushed out of bed and joined a handful of neighbors already gathering outside. Quinn's house was swarming with police cars, an ambulance, the whole 9 yards. We stood there, stunned, as the cops emerged from his house, escorting that girl in handcuffs. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She just accepted what was happening, and stared straight ahead with a blank expression. Then we saw Quinn. They rushed him out on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess. I gasped the moment I saw him. We didn't see him again for an entire week after that. I was worried sick. But when he finally came back, Benjamin and I walked over to check on him. Quinn let us in without hesitation, and told us everything. Apparently, that girl, her name was Ellie, had confessed to everything, which made things easier for the police. For starters, she wasn't supposed to. She wasn't supposed to have a key to his house. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. According to Quinn, things had taken a turn when she started asking for more, fancy dinners, jewelry, expensive trips. And when he hesitated, she got possessive. Angry. That's when everything in their relationship started going downhill. Every time she had shown up unannounced, Quinn hadn't realized she'd gained access to his location through his phone. Which, I'll be honest, I didn't even know was possible. She had gone through all of his stuff. But the worst part? She had planted hidden cameras in his bedroom. Every time she returned to his house while he was gone, she was there to replace the batteries, to make sure they were still working. That argument I overheard in the driveway? That was Quinn trying to break up with her. She refused. Eventually, he agreed, reluctantly, to just take a break. But Ellie had already seen and heard everything, through those cameras. The very next night, she went to his house. With a knife. I'm not going to explain all the details. You can probably imagine. Somehow, Quinn managed to fight her off and get her to the ground. But not before she seriously injured him. The doctor said he was an inch away from needing surgery, or dying. Benjamin and I tried to comfort him, but he was visibly shaken. He looked like a ghost. The last thing he said before we left was that he had learned his lesson, about flaunting his money. Especially around pretty girls. He moved out not long after that. Said he didn't feel safe in that house anymore. That Ellie had friends, lots of friends, just like her. And the thought that any one of them might have known where he lived, it was too much. We never saw him again. I just pray to God he's doing okay. No one should ever have to go through something like that. Especially not someone so young. Story number 3. I moved into my new place looking for a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say I had a bad situation with an ex that made staying in my old city impossible. Early in life, I ran into some money and made some bad decisions, especially about the kind of women I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to is really nice, low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses here are spaced out, which was partly what drew me to the area. But for some reason, the property next to mine is much closer to mine than most of the other houses are to each other. By the way, that house next door is huge. When I first saw it, I thought it could easily fit a family of 10. Honestly, that was my first assumption, that a big family lived there. Maybe great-grandparents and everything. But I could not have been more wrong. Even though I wanted to keep a low profile, I wasn't going to be a rude neighbor. I took it upon myself to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, I decided to introduce myself to my next-door neighbors last. I can't tell you why. Everyone else I met seemed really sweet and genuine. I'd say 90% of them were parents of young children. Yes, they were all slightly intimidating, purely because of how successful they seemed to be. I wasn't too sure how a younger guy like me would easily blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal concern. When I finally got around to meeting my next-door neighbor, my social battery was mostly drained from having spent the day making small talk with strangers. I knew if I just went back home, I'd never be motivated to meet them. So, I sucked it up and walked up their driveway. I'd gotten used to being greeted by someone middle-aged, so when a young-looking dude with a mullet opened the door, I was a little taken aback. Hell, he looked even younger than me, which was definitely a shock. I recovered quickly and went ahead with my new-to-the-neighborhood spiel. As I spoke, he flashed me this massive smile and he actually cut me off before I could even finish talking. He said something like, "Oh wow, someone who was born in my decade. What a nice surprise." I laughed and told him the same thing. I ended up venting a little, about how out of place I felt as a single guy in my late 20s, surrounded by so many families with kids. He told me not to worry about that. Most of the people who lived here kept to themselves. That was kind of a relief for me. He introduced himself as Damon and told me I should come by for a drink sometime. I shrugged and said, "Hell, why not? Right now?" I expected him to laugh and invite me in. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, like he was scanning his living room. Then he turned back and said he wished he could, but he was busy working. I asked what he did for work, felt like a normal follow-up question. He dropped his smile a bit, stared at me for a moment, then laughed awkwardly. "Finance," he said, but didn't elaborate any further. I thought that was a bit strange. I told him, fair enough, and asked if he had any roommates. To my surprise, he said he lived there alone. That was absolutely insane to me, given how big the house was. We chatted for a few more minutes. Before going back inside, he gave me his number. I was excited that someone my age lived here, especially because he seemed like a really chill guy. But I couldn't get over how odd it was for someone like that to live all alone. Yeah, I know, I was essentially doing the same thing. But keep in mind, my house wasn't even half the size of his. Anyway, I went back home and got on with my life. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful really happened. I texted Damon a few days after he gave me his number, trying to set something up. But he always complained about how busy he was and apologized for not being able to hang out. Eventually, I gave up on him, not in a hostile way, just in a you do you kind of way. I'm definitely not the type of person to bend over backwards for someone who seems disinterested. I never saw anyone coming or going from Damon's place. No visitors. No parties. No girls. Nothing. He never even got takeout delivered, which was strange because his car was always parked in the driveway. I genuinely didn't know what he ate. I literally never saw him leave the house. The guy lived like a ghost. I work from home, and my office is on the 3rd floor. From there, I can see Damon's property. If you're wondering how I knew so much about his living habits, well, that's how. I know it sounds obsessive, maybe even a little creepy. But his house was just a glance away from my monitor. I couldn't help but look over from time to time. One night, it was a Wednesday, I remember that distinctly. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so that's probably how I woke up so easily. At first, I thought I was imagining it or that it was part of a really vivid dream I was having. But I was wrong. I got out of bed and peeked out my window. There they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Damon's driveway. There was no mistaking it. He was having a party. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the type to complain about noise. I've been to my fair share of house parties. But it was the middle of the week, and the volume was insane. I figured I'd just go over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. It was a full-blown party, that much was clear from outside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I pulled out my phone to text Damon but decided against it, knowing he'd probably ignore me or give me some BS excuse. The following morning, I knocked on the door again, harder this time. Still nothing. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. But to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs. But there was something off. There was literally no one inside. I moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room, maybe the kitchen. But it was completely empty. There weren't even any drinks left out. I could hear people over the music that was playing in the background, though, which I didn't understand. Then I really listened. Everything hit me all at once. It wasn't even music, it was a recording. A literal recording of people laughing, yelling, clinking glasses. The whole party was fake. But that didn't make sense to me. It still didn't explain the shoes or the cars. There were people in that house, that much was certain. I should have turned around right then. But I needed to know what was going on. I moved discreetly around the house until I saw a door that was slightly ajar. I gently pushed it open, and it led down to the basement. I'm not sure how I knew, but something told me what I was looking for was downstairs. It was dark down those stairs, except for a very faint light coming from somewhere I couldn't see. There was no reason to go down there, I knew that, but I did it anyway. I got to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The light was coming from another door somewhere deeper in the basement. I crept toward it. As I got closer, I started to pick up on another noise I hadn't heard earlier over the music. It sounded almost mechanical. It was this heavy, rhythmic grinding, like heavy machinery or a buzz saw. I got a little closer, close enough to see through the crack. There were 3 people standing in there. They were looking across the room at something out of view. They were all older men, significantly older than Damon. They wore heavy-duty work clothes, protective goggles, and thick rubber gloves. I also noticed they were wearing work boots. Even though I had seen all those other shoes upstairs under different circumstances, I would have assumed they were construction workers. I really wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was too far out of view. After a few seconds of standing there, I started to notice this awful bleach smell, some kind of cleaning solution. That's what did it for me. Suddenly, I felt this awful pit in my stomach, like my life was in danger. I can't really explain it. I turned to leave, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I made my way back to the stairs, the light behind me suddenly dimmed, like someone had shut the door. I didn't actually hear the door over the music, but I felt it. I sprinted up the stairs as fast as I could. I ran through the house and burst out the front door. But I didn't run directly to my house. I jumped my own fence and made it to the backyard. I slipped in through my side door, locking it behind me. My chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could I let Damon or any of those other guys know it was me who had been snooping around. I gathered myself and went up to my office. Making sure all the lights were off, I crouched down below the window and peeked over at Damon's house. There was no one there. But then, a few minutes later, the front door flew open. About 8 guys poured out, scanning the yard, the driveway, the street. But Damon wasn't with them. I could tell because everyone looked older, like the first guys I had seen. A few of them looked like they were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. One of the men actually shoved another, and I thought they were about to start fighting in the street. But they didn't. Eventually, they all went back inside. The music stopped soon after. I stood at the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? The music wasn't playing anymore, and there was no real crime I could report. The thing I couldn't understand was how none of my other neighbors seemed to have a problem with the loud music. Especially since most of them had children. I figured if they had heard it and called the police, Damon would know it was me. And the shoes, I had no idea what that was about, either. The people I had seen were all wearing boots. So, did they bring extra pairs just to leave in the foyer? I had too many questions, and I didn't know what to do. So, I just went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. Every single car was gone, including Damon's. I went upstairs to try to get some work done, but I couldn't concentrate. I found myself looking over at Damon's house every 5 seconds. After a few hours with his car not there, I decided to go for a walk. Partly to clear my head, but mostly to take some low-key glances through his windows. Nothing. Days passed, and Damon still hadn't returned. At least, his car hadn't. I was baffled. With every passing day, I still couldn't figure out how my other neighbors had been able to sleep through all the noise that night. So, I just straight up asked them. I went to a few houses and asked if they had heard the party Damon had a few nights ago. No one knew what I was talking about. Even after I told them which house it was coming from and how late it was. I thought I was going crazy. That was a few months ago now. The crazy thing is, Damon still hasn't returned. It's clear no one is maintaining his house, the grass is starting to get really long. There's an untouched pile of packages leaning against his front door. I don't know what to make of this. It could be nothing. But I feel like no one would go to such lengths to disguise what they were doing with the fake party unless it was something illegal. But would people going to such lengths really forget something as important as locking the front door? Maybe that's what those guys had been arguing about. I really have no idea. And the fact that none of my other neighbors seemed bothered by it makes me think I'm involved in some huge conspiracy or something. I know I'm just being paranoid. But I have so many unanswered questions. When Damon returns, if he ever does, I'm debating whether or not I should just go and ask him straight up.